anyone have any questions?
Don't be afraid of the group sugar equilibrium.
Yep, hi. Could you please explain your argument about how cryptocurrencies can overcome the velocity arguments and enable multiple currencies to exist equally fairly? Could you expand on that, please?
Sure. So the arguments that I had there was basically the issue of the issue that really there's a sort of friction effect, and there's this software-based bounded rationality effect where if there is some small difference, even if you have currency A and you have currency B, and currency A is somewhat larger than B, and because of that A has somewhat higher liquidity, even still the difference between A and B can be so small in practice that people don't have the sufficient incentive to make the jump from one to the other. They don't really have particular incentive to care. And so the argument is that if, in the case of cryptocurrencies, if the software writers have the desire to keep on creating new currencies, and one major reason why you want to create new currencies is because if you control a currency, then you have the ability to use the currency to incentivize stuff. Then, if the software authors have that incentive, then guess what? We're going to have software that supports multiple currencies, and we're going to have multiple currencies. And I guess the important point is that actually, because we have all this technology, moving between different currencies seamlessly is becoming easier and easier. So potentially, like the main reason why I guess something like the euro, for example, made things in Europe simpler is because if people are traveling around, they don't need to have 10 different currencies anymore. But with computers and with smart wallets, having 2,000 different currencies in your smartphone is pretty trivial, and we can create apps to try and like optimize the experience for you so it looks incredibly easy. So basically, the cost of multi-currency to the user are sufficiently low that the user has no incentive to care, and the benefits to software developers exist.
I got two. I'm wondering if, in the exploration of game theoretical questions, you have considered sex, or put it another way, the generation of diversity. Why a project like Ethereum might create a singularity versus, or you talked about, for instance, one currency may rule them all. In other words, when we look at the evolution, physical evolution and genetic evolution, it took a hell of a long time before sex evolved and a large diversity of functional forms occurred. Yeah? When you look at the mathematics, it's been a while since I studied this, of the generation of diversity, the creation of artificial islands between species was between locations. You had a very small element of transfer of information between the mainland and the island. You resulted in a single species, less than 1%, I think it was, 1 to 2%. I'm just wondering, I'm out of date in terms of my knowledge of these questions. I'm wondering if you can, in your consideration of this, whether you've thought much about the mathematics of the generation of diversity.
Okay. So in general, when you want to ask whether or not a particular analogy applies, well, one way to do that is to try to formally model the analogy, formally model what you're trying to figure out, and try and see if the two formal models align with each other, right? So in the case of two species on two islands, and they suddenly meet with each other, the formal, you have this formal model where you have these species, each of which reproduce, and the two species simultaneously end up competing for certain kinds of resources. So the question is that also an accurate model to use in order to describe cryptographic platforms? So first of all, one major difference, I suppose, is that animals do not have the ability to just switch species. Animals do not have the ability to sort of convert from one species to another on a high liquidity exchange. But it's yeah, viruses can. So maybe I guess in the case of, well, what happens in the case of viruses? Does one dominate, or are there a whole bunch of them? Well, viruses actually mutate really quickly, so there's never really one species at all, is there? So, yeah, I'm really not sure.
I'm just imagining kitty coin and dog coin. But anyway.
I don't think kitty coin and dog coin have the same number of chromosomes in their hash signatures, you know?
First of all, thank you very much for coming over and giving a great talk, by the way. That's much appreciated. My question was, could you talk a little bit about the game theoretics of people who would consider forking Ethereum? Not only the people who would do it, but also whether users would use it and how that comes into a Nash equilibrium, if at all.
So 2 kinds of forks. One kind of fork is where you start a fork of the blockchain from 100 blocks behind it, and you try to make that fork win, like a double spend. And the second kind of fork being like an actual, where you actually sort of, it doesn't really have a sort of that kind of character to it. It's just another fork starting from the Genesis block, and it tries to be its own currency. In that case, I suppose, you have 2 different currencies, and you have the question of how much do you value one versus how much you value the other. So one argument I usually give, for why Bitcoin is going to continue to be valuable, even if all these new platforms come up and they're all much better, is it's also basically it's a Grim Trigger Schelling point argument, basically. The idea is that if Bitcoin is at the top, then Bitcoin is at the top, that's fine. But if Bitcoin loses first place to some other coin, then that itself removes the norm that Bitcoin is going to be at the top, and therefore the second coin is going to be much more likely to lose to some third coin, and so forth. And therefore, because of that, because people know that if it goes from Bitcoin to a second coin, that the second coin is much more likely to lose, the second coin is not going to gain as high a value, and therefore, as it turns out, Bitcoin is going to end up being the most valuable after all. So that kind of argument you could also apply within the context of an individual family of currencies as well. So you could imagine, like, if someone, we'll use an unaffiliated one as an example. If there exists BitShares X, and if someone says, okay, I'm going to create BitShares Y, and it's going to get released, then the problem is that BitShares X has this sort of Schelling point quality to it, which is that it's the first, right? But if someone releases BitShares Y, then someone else is going to release BitShares Z, BitShares AA, BitShares AB, BitShares AC, and so forth. And BitShares X clearly has this quality to it that it was first. All the others don't really have a distinguishing factor. So therefore, by a Schelling point argument, people are more likely to coordinate on the first one. And then the reason why the first one is likely to stay is because of this sort of Grim Trigger argument that if it switches to a different one, it's going to switch to a different one again. And so the second one's never going to get that high.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a very down-to-earth question. If I understood the presentation correctly, there still are some challenges, for instance, relying on altruism, etc. But am I right in assuming that the first version of Ethereum is soon to come out? So are these challenges quite serious?
No, so the challenges are, first of all, there's the scalability. Ethereum 1.0 is not going to be handling scalability by itself, right? Scalability is we're sort of explicitly saying that's a 2.0 problem. The second, in terms of all these proof of stake, proof of work issues, they do affect it. I mean, to be honest, I think as I've said on the blog post earlier today, it seems likely that we're going to go with either proof of work or proof of activity, or maybe this bonded proof of work, which I only came up with 5 hours ago, so I don't really know if it actually works or not. So, I mean, we're probably going to end up with something simpler. And just because we want to get something out, and we don't want to test like 3 revolutionary ideas at the same time, because that's generally, you have three times the risk of failure that way, and then eventually move to proof of stake over time as we work out the game theory, and then move to a scalable 2.0 over time as we work out the game theory of that.
Sorry, just one more question. Finally, CPU plus bond, that was a question mark?
Yes.
Is this the strong idea at the moment? Is this what you plan to go with?
As I was saying, CPU plus bond is an idea that I just came up with in my head about 5 hours ago, so I have not had enough time to consult with people and see if it's actually viable or if it has some fatal flaw in it. I mean, if it seems like it has maybe somewhere between a 30 and 50% chance of actually being promising, but.
Yeah, hi there. That was a fascinating talk, and I really enjoyed a lot of your analogies and breakdown. One question I've got, how long do you think the world's going to continue to need currency for? Because there are many things that are essential for human life that we take that are free. For example, oxygen in the air. I walk around, I breathe. It's probably the most valuable thing to me, but it's unlimited consumption, so I don't pay anything for it. Many other things are going that way. So if I wanted a record collection 100 years ago, I'd have to have loads of vinyls, and they'd cost £50 each. Nowadays, I can have 1 million songs on my iPod, and I could download for nothing or pay a subscription. So as more and more things move to being digital, and you know, and also obviously there's a lot of contractual stuff that Ethereum could actually take out of our society. You might not have to pay for lawyers, so a lot of services would disappear. How long do you think we're actually going to need a currency for as a human race?
Okay, so first of all, there's generally two major categories of economic goods. One kind is what's called rivalrous goods, and the other kind is called non-rivalrous. Well, there's actually 4 categories, but just to simplify it. So rivalrous goods basically means if I have it, someone else doesn't. And non-rivalrous means that everyone can have it. If I have it, I can copy it, and everyone else can have it at the same time. So like, you know, an atmosphere that's not polluted is non-rivalrous. Information is non-rivalrous, technology isn't. Now money, the reason why people use money is because it's an efficient sort of central liquidity medium between different kinds of rivalrous goods. So as long as there exist agents that care about rivalrous goods to some extent, from that sort of the whole sort of post-scarcity argument is not going to lead to money disappearing, I think. Like it might be that, you know, we have this sort of environment where eventually some combination of governments and charities and Starbucks is going to come up, is going to just, you know, provide like free food and free water and free hospitals for everyone, and we're all going to be able to survive 30,000 years without ever touching a single currency token. But even still, I think like machines and rich people might end up, and you know, corporations might end up transacting with each other. But there's actually another interesting threat to the concept of money that I think is sort of underappreciated, which is this concept of combinatorial auctions. So basically money solves the problem of this sort of double coincidence of wants problem. How do you find, if you don't have money, then if I have a chair and you have a banana, then in order for us to trade, I have to simultaneously want a banana and you have to simultaneously want a chair at the same time. So without money, you need to find 2 people that sort of have exactly align in those 2 ways, right? So an issue is that with the whole sort of big data theme of the 21st century, potentially we might end up inventing combinatorial algorithms that sort of do in like extreme like multi-thousand or even multi-million party matching to try to make trades happen between a whole bunch of people at the same time. And if that happens, the need for we might end up doing everything without money to some degree. Whether or not that actually happens. Whether or not that's actually going to happen, interesting question. If that happens, whether or not that's going to like completely make the public goods problem disappear is an interesting question, one I'm more skeptical on, but we'll see. Who knows?
Sorry, just make sure everyone gets a chance.
Hi, I'm Doug. I just want to confirm, did you say you will be proceeding with proof of work? Just because you just mentioned it, just to most likely for the...
Looks like, or at least a very heavy proof of work component for 1.0. Like, it's not because I love proof of work, right? You know, I don't. I think it's terrible for the environment and it leads to horrible centralization. Unless you have ASIC resistant proof of work, but even then, you know, you can't be 100% confident it's going to remain that way. But it's you know, if you saw my recent post on proof of stake, or at least this morning, proof of stake is hard, and it's much less elegant. It's much harder to figure out than a robust proof of work protocol. And I would not want the world to lose a generalized consensus platform just because Slasher turns out to have some weird, you know, bribing equilibrium vulnerability.
Just going to say there's a project called Metaphase, which is quite recent, which is that barter algorithm for finding barter circles or barter topologies in large data. I don't know if there are others you know of, but that's a recent one.
Okay, excellent. I've not heard of that, but that's I'll look at that.
Hello. Yep. Thank you very much for presenting today. Very nice presentation. I was thinking about your sort of attack contract, which I thought was really interesting. So in a way, you could say that that's one way for cooperation to exist, where you would normally not have it. You might get 6 of the 10 miners in the world to do something bad, right? But I think the counter argument to that is that, well, sure, you can get 6 miners to do that, but you still have all the stakeholders, those who own the coin, and they would have a strong incentive to punish these 6 miners, right? They could pull another 10 miners out of the either. They could just, pay someone to come in and mine against these people and undo their work, and therefore also cost them their deposit, the deposit they put in to go into this attack contract. So their punishment is actually very effective.
So basically you're saying that the stakeholders as a group are going to make an even larger coordination than the first coordination in order to defeat it?
Yes.
First of all, let's say, first of all, one problem is that in the case where you have a currency with ASICs, there's only a finite amount of power. There's only a finite amount of mining hardware in existence, and in this particular case, the coordination already controls 60% of it. In the case where you basically have where proof of work is a liquid market, then okay, so 60% of the miners coordinate, then the stakeholders get together and perhaps enter into some second contracts that would bring in like another 300% from outside the system. Then I suppose that it's ultimately going to be a matter of who's richer. I guess it's not completely so. Actually, no. Here's the problem. So first of all, if we create this, if you create this fork, so if the 60% create the fork and they win, as soon as they win, the value of the coin is really dropping pretty hard, right? So these miners are not going to hold on to that many of the currency units, and the ones that they have, they're going to immediately dump on the market. And already, the miners, they also gain some income by double spending. All those coins are going to dump on the market as well, and they're going to trade them for some other crypto tokens, or potentially even trade them for like products, dollars, other digital assets, and so forth. So the 60% coalition no longer has any particular presence on that chain whatsoever. So even if they get double spent after that, it's already too late.
It's not exactly too late though, because your contract, the original one, says that they don't get their deposit back unless the chain, the bad chain, wins. So if you can just make that bad chain lose.
So if you can make if you can set up your own collusion before the bad chain collusion wins. So in order for that to work, you're basically relying on the empirical assumption that it's faster to set up. It's so fast to set up this kind of coalition and get it going that you can do it faster than it takes for one of these 20 block forks to succeed. So that's an empirical assertion, and my hunch is that it's probably false. Just because you can't get thousands of people suddenly working together within the space of 1 or 2 hours. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you for a great speech. According to game theory, correct me if I'm wrong, it would be beneficial to make an attack if the potential profit is greater than the cost of gathering the computational force required to do such an attack. So, I guess that especially applies to the scalability, where you have smaller nodes where the computational power will be less. Yep. Would it be possible to control the amount of computational mining power in each step, so that if, for example, a group realizes that some external party is adding a lot of computational power,
then automatically increase the difficulty on that chain by a factor of 1,000, probably. Yeah. The only problem with that actually is that first of all, in the sort of simpler protocol, generally, if you want to validate a blockchain, you have to have the state, right? You have to have the state data, and downloading the state data is going to take some amount of time. So, because of that, it's going to take time for new nodes to join the network. The way that you can get around that, I suppose, is by going to this other protocol where you have each block containing basically a proof of its own validity, and then have people vote on that directly. So it'll probably take a couple of extra patches, but you definitely could try to make it automatic in that sense. The only thing that you'd have to be concerned with is that if you have this protocol that you want it to be secure against a miner that has 90% power on one chain, so you want it to sort of do an alarm where there's a dispute, where there's a 90-10 dispute. The problem is an attacker can get 10% on one chain, which is really just 0.1%. If it was just 0.1%, that attacker can claim that they're being persecuted on that particular chain, and they can claim a lot of attention on it. So you have to be worried. You have to sort of be careful that you're not going to get like a denial of service attack of that kind.
Any other questions? One more.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. It was great. I'm interested in the concept of smart contracts. And as you rightfully said, the weakest or the biggest problem with smart contracts is actually the data that exists outside of the blockchain, how to verify it so that you don't, because otherwise you have a problem of trust. And you talked about mathematical proof, global facts, and local facts. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but for the greatest class of contracts that are going to be used with Ethereum, it's probably about local facts. So
possibly, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. And
yeah, so
what are the strategies to, I don't know, work with that?
With local facts, basically you need to rely on a plain old boring arbitration system, just like laws have been doing for, just like a legal system has been doing for 10,000 years. You can make arbitration but more efficient by having an open marketplace for it, but that's just about as far as you can get. Theoretically, in some limited cases, like I think particularly something like developing a website, you could in some cases sort of take a local fact and turn it into a more global fact by just randomly selecting a jury. So one example would be if I wanted to pay a developer to upgrade my website, what I would do is I could actually have if the website is managed by a contract, I could set the contract up to automatically use the new web page, say 10% of the time, and then keep track of some statistics, basically, whether the new website ends up receiving substantially more click-throughs or like product or purchases and so forth. So you could maybe automate A/B testing in some fashion. But aside from that, so there's sort of those kinds of very situation-specific approaches. But yeah, generally, this isn't Skynet. It's not going to solve everything. Maybe fortunately.
Vitalik, thank you for that very eloquent presentation. I've been doing a little bit of thinking about how the metaphors, or maybe just the implicit metaphors we use, limit and shape the way that we think about these types of problems. And one metaphor in particular that was quite prevalent in your presentation was the one of a rationally self-interested actor. It's
not a metaphor so much as a model, but
well, you can call it a model. That's fine. I don't think you're wrong. What I mean though is I'm not really convinced that that is either the fundamental or the dominant dynamic in human behavior. Something like second personal relations might be more predominant and more fundamental.
So,
something like in the biological realm, something like symbiosis actually turns out to be a little bit more predominant and fundamental than competition.
Well, the reason why symbiosis, you could explain that the reason why symbiosis ends up being effective is because it's a multi-round game. So biology, I would actually argue, is like the ultimate, probably one of the most sort of the systems that comply with game theory the most, because it's done on the level of genes, and genes, and there's a clear utility function, which is how many children you have and so forth. So another point is that there's a bit of a misconception, which is that people think that if being rational basically means caring only about money. It's not quite true. What it means is just having some consistent objective. So in this case, those utility functions could be anything, and you could have. So first of all, you could have altruists, and pointed out in certain circumstances there could actually be altruists that exist in certain contexts. But it's a matter you have to sort of think about first of all. if someone's not being rational, so no matter what goals you have, in a lot of cases, you could still benefit from money. So even if you're an altruist and you wanted to save your mom from dying of cancer, you might still want money in order to pay her medical bills and so forth. So that's another argument that you could make. So generally, if you want to find an exception, to a lot of the logic here, then the two big categories of exceptions that you're going to see are, first of all, people are going to end up being altruistic to some extent, and there could also be motives that are unaccounted for. So people seek social status, which isn't really particularly well represented here. And in other cases, that there might be situations where, for some reason, people prefer having less money to more money, which happens sometimes. So I think the most productive thing is seeing these as models that work the majority of the time, and yet sometimes they don't. And when they don't, what you want to figure out is what model actually does work in order to explain reality. So in this case, I talked about this model of people people being boundedly rational and following heuristics, and that seems to produce better results both in real life and in cryptocurrency sometimes, as I mentioned. And otherwise, if neither of those models work, then you'll have to find a model that does.
Yes. Well, I mean, one thing that I was thinking is, a lot of the way people think is they create situations where Nash equilibrium is reached by people competing. Mm. And that works reasonably well with, say, proof of work. But you can also create situations where people are forced to play a game where there just is no possibility for competition. They just have some form of buy-in by design where collaboration is the only option. I think a fairly decent example of that might be coin shuffle.
Right. So in the case of coin shuffle, everyone collaborating is the Nash equilibrium, right? Like, Nash equilibrium does not mean nasty British in short. Nash equilibrium means a strategy that everyone, given their goals, wants to stick to. So, I mean, there's nothing fundamental in economics that sort of prioritizes competition in any way, I would say. Sometimes competition ends up being a better strategy. Sometimes cooperation ends up being a better strategy. I would even argue that the cooperation effect is dominant.
Hey, thanks for the entertaining talk. I have a very basic question. Basically, I would like to hear your thoughts on like the choice between centralized and decentralized systems. Mm-hmm. So decentralized systems obviously have a cost of decentralization, and centralized system, you can argue that they become, immoral monopolies. No. Is there a game theoretical approach that would allow us to choose between the two?
Okay, so centralized services. So first of all, there's an economic model of monopoly pricing where you note that a centralized actor does not have the incentive to provide their service under the conditions that are socially optimal. They have the incentive to provide a service under the conditions that maximize benefit to themselves. So, what that means is that they will often have the incentive to either cripple the product or increase fees, or increase fees metaphorically. Like you could increase fees metaphorically, I mean in the sense of adding some kind of proprietary lock-in mechanisms to things, and the reason why they do that is because even though from that they lose customers, they lose customers who otherwise could have benefited, and it's a loss for everyone. On the other hand, they also gain profit because there's a whole bunch of people who would be willing to get the product under both the old terms and the new terms. So that's so from that whole point of view, there's a lot of argument that things like lower barriers to entry, things like more competition are a good thing. Another argument against centralization is also it's basically just plain old combinatorics. So if you assume that every centralized entity has some probability of failing and some probability of being evil in some way, I guess you can say, then if that probability is 1%, then a centralized system has a 1%, or let's say 1% per year, then a centralized system has a 1% chance of failing. But a system that's 2 out of 3 has only a 0.03% chance of failing because you actually need 2 out of those 3 to fail at the same time. So that's so realistically, it's probably going to be a combination of both of those approaches. It's first of all, it's the probability that the whole thing is just going to continue to work, even in the face of individual unreliable actors. And second of all, it's the fact that if people know they are indispensable, they're going to use that fact to exploit you. And so, and as the main argument in favor of centralization, I suppose, that decentralized things are just plain harder to implement, as we've all learned.
Is the best way to solve the sort of local problem of verifying a contract just to have a sort of digital escrow system? So rather than you coming along and paying someone £10 to wash your car, you put in 50 quid, and the person who's going to do the washing the car puts in 20, 30 pounds, and both of you, if you both don't agree, then the money's locked up and can never be accessed. Is that
problem with that is that it's vulnerable to extortion attacks. You can basically say, I'm not going to consent. I'm going to just let the money lock up forever unless you agree to do the thing that maximally favors me, except that you get $1.
But if you've both got money in the system, that's not the case. If you pay far more.
Okay, so let's say we have this approach where you have the consumer and a merchant. Consumer selling a product to a merchant consumer wants to buy a product from a merchant for $50. So what we're going to have is consumer sends, let's say, $70 into an escrow, merchant sends $20, and theoretically, if the whole thing works out, then out of those $90, the merchant is going to get 70, and the consumer is going to get 20. So on the whole, the consumer loses 15, merchant gains 15, and it all works out. Now here's the problem. Okay, you have 90 in the pool. Now the merchant says, I'm not going to deliver the product. Too bad, but what I am going to do is I am going to say that I am going to give you the option of sending the funds, of signing the transaction to unlock the funds, sending 20 back to yourself and sending 70 to me anyway, even though you only intended to do that in the event that I actually sent you the product. Well, guess what? You just lost $20, and if you want, you're down $70, and if you want $20 back, then please sign the transaction for me. It's the only shot that you have. So I guess the only counter argument you could get is that people in reality are going to often end up sort of feeling resentment and just not going along with the process. But even still, if it has it's an economic security hole, and it might end up happening, especially for higher values. So, look, the kinds of schemes that do actually work to solve this, like the best scheme I know that does the best at sort of solving this problem. The problem is basically hard because the information of whether or not the thing actually happened is to some degree outside the system. So there's something called Trust Davis, where the way it's basically kind of like a reputation system tied to an insurance system. So the way that solves things is that the consumer is insured, and the merchant is insured, and the system treats merchant fraud as the merchant not delivering the product as an insurable event that the consumer can collect on, and the consumer can obviously commit insurance fraud themselves, and they can claim they never received the product when the merchant actually sent it. But if they do that, then the merchant has the ability to claim that as an event as well. So the argument is that sort of balances out in some way. But it's basically, on the whole, I'd say it's a very hard problem. If you can solve it, then you've made just about every single market on the darknet 10 times safer. You've just made a whole bunch of trade, between people in third world countries a lot safer. It's like a nice solution. A nice solution would benefit, pretty much, very, very disparate and a whole bunch of different sectors, different sort of low trust sectors of society.
I'm just going to add to that. Where do you think arbitration or judgment as a service comes into those sort of escrow systems and problems?
I mean, an escrow contract can say, if there's a disagreement, then that contract will call to a bunch of judges and it will take the median reply as an answer. And in that, something like, in those cases, you could have multiple, you could have either one or more arbitrators actually adjudicate. So judges as a service is a market that will exist, and it's just a contract's choice to how they wish to have those judges plug in. Like potentially you could even have a contract that lists a bunch of clauses in English, and each individual clause has a separate judge for deciding it. So, it's your choice which one among those of all those different choices you take.
For judge as a service, how do you assign a reputation? Because if you win the case, I'm going to give them a bad
judges are assigned a reputation.
Sorry?
Sure, judges are assigned a reputation.
So if they're assigned a reputation, but if we have a dispute going on, and the judge favours your side of the deal, then I'm going to give him a negative reputation.
Yeah.
And you give him a positive one, net zero. How do you get a fair view of that reputation?
So you would probably rely rely on the fact that people who end up being embroiled in disputes are more likely to be less reputable. So people who have like a perfect track record are going to be more reputable, and the reputation is going to be worth more. So in theory, the system should weight itself to give more weight to nice people. But
that would allow extortion as soon as you're rich enough.
It might. I mean, I actually don't think that there's necessarily a clean economic solution to the whole problem that doesn't rely on either a whole bunch of people being altruistic or some kind of like direct access to a way of adjudicating whether or not some particular event actually happened.
Any other questions? I'll hand back to Stephen. Get it right.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Alrighty.